You just made a simple decision. Maybe you chose to leave a party early, declined an invitation, or decided not to explain why you're upset. But instead of feeling confident in your choice, you immediately launch into a detailed explanation. I'm so sorry, I'm just really tired because I didn't sleep well last night, and I have this early morning tomorrow, plus I've been dealing with some family stuff. Sound familiar? What if I told you that this compulsive need to justify every decision, every boundary, every authentic impulse is not politeness, it's a psychological prison? Carl Jung understood something profound about human behavior that most people never recognize. When you constantly explain yourself to others, you're not being considerate. You're abandoning yourself, you're seeking permission to exist as you are. Jung believed that true psychological maturity, what he called individuation, begins the moment you stop needing others to understand your choices. Today, we're going to explore why your endless explanations are actually a form of self-betrayal, and how everything in your life changes when you finally give yourself permission to exist without justification. The person you become when you stop explaining yourself might be the person you were always meant to be. Carl Jung's concept of individuation reveals why we become trapped in patterns of over-explanation. Jung understood that most people live their entire lives seeking what he called collective approval, constantly checking whether their thoughts, feelings, and actions align with others' expectations. This creates what Jung identified as a false persona, a mask we wear to gain acceptance even if it means betraying our authentic self. When you feel compelled to explain every decision, you're operating from what Jung called the wounded child archetype, the part of you that learned early in life that your natural impulses were wrong, inappropriate, or needed to be justified to be acceptable. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but he also understood that becoming authentic requires what he called the courage of solitude, the willingness to stand in your truth even when others don't understand or approve. The constant need to explain is actually the ego's desperate attempt to maintain connection while avoiding the risk of rejection. But Jung discovered something revolutionary. The more you explain yourself, the less authentic you become, and paradoxically, the less others respect you. True power, Jung understood, lies not in being understood by everyone, but in understanding yourself so deeply that others' opinions become irrelevant. Meet Marcus, a 32-year-old software architect who has turned over-explanation into an art form. He can't order coffee without explaining his caffeine sensitivity, can't decline social invitations without providing a detailed itinerary of his alternative plans, and can't express any opinion without immediately following it with disclaimers and justifications. Last week, when his colleague criticized his code, Marcus spent 20 minutes explaining his thought process, the time constraints he was under, the different approaches he considered, and why he ultimately chose his solution. His colleague had already moved on after the first sentence, but Marcus couldn't stop talking. What Marcus doesn't realize is that his chronic over-explanation stems from a childhood with a highly critical mother who demanded justification for every feeling, every preference, every natural impulse he had. Why are you sad? That's not a good reason to be sad. Why don't you like that food? You should appreciate what you have. Why do you want to be alone? That's antisocial. Marcus learned that his inner experience was never valid on its own. It always needed external approval and logical justification to be acceptable. Now at 32, he's still seeking permission from the world to exist as he is, and the exhaustion of constant self-justification is slowly crushing his authentic spirit. Marcus's compulsive explaining serves several unconscious functions that Jung would recognize as neurotic adaptations. First, it's a preemptive defense against criticism. If he explains everything thoroughly, surely no one can find fault with his reasoning. Second, it's an attempt to control others' perceptions of him, believing that the right explanation will guarantee approval and understanding. Third, it's a way of avoiding the vulnerability of simply being himself without justification. But Jung understood that these defensive strategies actually create the very problems they're trying to solve. The more Marcus explains, the more he signals to others that his choices are questionable and need defending. The more he seeks to control others' perceptions, the more authentic connection becomes impossible because he's never actually showing up as himself. The more he avoids vulnerability, the more isolated and misunderstood he becomes. Jung identified this as what he called a neurotic paradox. The unconscious behaviors we use to feel safe actually create more of what we fear. Marcus's over-explanation has trained everyone in his life to expect justification for his every move, creating a dynamic where his autonomy is constantly questioned and his authentic impulses are always subject to external validation. Jung identified the specific psychological mechanism behind chronic over-explanation, what he called the tyranny of the should, combined with an underdeveloped relationship with the self. Marcus operates from a core belief that his natural impulses are inherently suspect and need to be verified by external authorities before they can be trusted or acted upon. This creates what Jung called a split in consciousness. Marcus has become so focused on how others perceive him that he's lost touch with his own inner authority. The mechanism works like this. Marcus feels an authentic impulse, but instead of trusting this feeling, his wounded psyche immediately activates the explanation protocol. This split between authentic feeling and compulsive justification prevents Marcus from ever developing what Jung called inner authority, the psychological capacity to trust your own experience as valid without external confirmation. The tragic irony is that the more Marcus explains himself, the less others trust his judgment, and the less he trusts himself. Jung understood that this creates a vicious cycle where the person becomes increasingly dependent on others' approval while simultaneously becoming less worthy of respect in others' eyes. Marcus's breakthrough came during a team meeting where his manager questioned a technical decision he'd made. As Marcus launched into his usual 20-minute explanation, complete with historical context, alternative approaches, and detailed justifications, something shifted inside him. He looked around the room and saw eyes glazing over, people checking their phones, the same pattern he'd created countless times before. In that moment, Marcus realized something profound. His explanations weren't helping anyone understand him better, they were actually making him less credible and less respected. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus stopped mid-sentence and said simply, "I chose this approach because I believe it's the best solution for our needs. If you'd like to discuss alternative approaches, I'm open to that conversation." The room fell silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. His manager nodded and moved on to the next topic. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the quiet dignity of standing in his own authority without needing to justify his existence. Jung called this moment the birth of individuation, when the authentic self finally stops seeking permission to exist and begins to trust its own judgment as inherently valid. I want you to pause here and examine your own relationship with explanation. When you make a decision to leave early, to say no, to express a preference, do you feel compelled to provide reasons? When someone questions your choice, do you immediately launch into justification mode? Do you find yourself explaining not just your actions, but your feelings, your preferences, even your right to have boundaries? And here's the deeper question Jung would ask. Whose approval are you really seeking when you over-explain? What are you afraid will happen if you simply state your truth without justification? Sometimes we don't realize that our politeness is actually a form of self-abandonment, and our consideration for others is really fear of being rejected for who we authentically are. Share in the comments below without over-explaining. Notice, if you want to, one area of your life where you find yourself constantly justifying your choices. Your honest recognition might help others see their own patterns of self-abandonment. Jung's approach to healing the compulsion to over-explain involved what he called active imagination, learning to dialogue with the part of yourself that seeks approval to understand what it's really protecting. Marcus began working with a therapist who understood Jung's individuation process. Instead of trying to stop explaining immediately, Marcus first had to understand the wounded child within him that believed his existence needed constant justification. Through inner work, Marcus discovered that his over-explanation was really a cry from a young part of himself that had never felt unconditionally accepted. The healing process involved Marcus learning to give himself the approval he'd been seeking from others. He started practicing what Jung called holding the tension, feeling the discomfort of not explaining himself without immediately rushing to fill the silence with justification. Marcus began with small experiments, ordering coffee without explaining his choice, declining invitations with a simple no thank you, expressing preferences without defending them. Each time he resisted the urge to over-explain, he felt a mixture of anxiety and liberation, the anxiety of the wounded child and the liberation of his authentic self, finally being allowed to exist without permission. 6 months after his breakthrough, Marcus's entire relational dynamic had shifted in ways he never expected. His communication became more powerful because it was more concise and authentic. Colleagues began seeking his opinion because when Marcus spoke, it carried weight. He wasn't diluting his insights with unnecessary justifications. His friendships deepened because people were finally meeting the real Marcus, not the over-explaining persona he'd been presenting for years. Most surprisingly, Marcus discovered that people respected him more when he stopped seeking their approval. His manager began giving him more autonomy because Marcus had demonstrated that he trusted his own judgment. Romantic relationships improved because partners were attracted to his self-possession rather than exhausted by his need for constant validation. Marcus learned what Jung meant when he said that individuation leads to right relationship. When you stop abandoning yourself to gain others' approval, you naturally attract people who appreciate your authentic self. The energy he had been using to construct elaborate explanations was now available for creativity, presence, and genuine connection with others. Marcus's journey reflects Jung's observation that over-explanation is a nearly universal pattern rooted in our collective disconnection from inner authority. In a culture that teaches us from childhood to justify our feelings, defend our preferences, and seek external validation for our choices, most people never develop what Jung called relationship with the self, the internal connection that makes others' opinions interesting but not essential. This pattern shows up everywhere. The parent who explains their parenting choices to other parents, the artist who justifies their creative vision to critics, the person who defends their lifestyle choices to family members who didn't ask. Jung understood that this compulsion stems from what he called collective unconsciousness, the shared belief that individual authenticity must be approved by the group to be valid. But Jung also discovered that when individuals stop seeking collective approval and start trusting their own inner authority, they often become leaders and innovators rather than followers and people-pleasers. The people who change the world, Jung observed, are usually those who stopped explaining themselves to others and started expressing themselves authentically, regardless of whether others understood or approved. Learning to stop over-explaining is an ongoing practice that requires constant vigilance against old patterns. Marcus still catches himself beginning to launch into unnecessary justifications, especially during times of stress or when dealing with particularly critical people. The difference now is that he recognizes the urge as information about his internal state rather than a requirement to act. Jung called this ongoing work the practice of individuation, constantly choosing authenticity over approval, self-trust over other trust, presence over performance. Marcus has developed what he calls his explanation pause. When he feels the urge to justify himself, he takes a breath and asks, "Am I explaining to provide necessary information, or am I explaining to seek approval?" This simple practice has become a form of meditation that keeps him connected to his authentic self. The goal isn't to become cold or uncommunicative, but to ensure that when he does explain himself, it's coming from a place of generous sharing rather than desperate seeking. Jung understood that true communication happens when we speak from our authentic self to others' authentic self, not from our wounded child to their judgment. Here's what Jung understood that most people never realize: every time you over-explain yourself, you're not being polite or considerate. You're training others to question your judgment and doubt your authority. You're teaching the world that your authentic self needs defending rather than simply being. The person you could become if you stopped seeking permission to exist might be more powerful, attractive, and respected than you can imagine. Starting today, I want you to experiment with what Jung called the courage of solitude, the willingness to make decisions, express preferences, and set boundaries without immediately launching into justification mode. Notice when you feel the compulsion to explain and ask yourself, am I sharing information that serves the situation or am I seeking approval for being myself? The next time someone questions your choice, try responding with simple acknowledgement. I understand you see it differently, or that's an interesting perspective, instead of defending your position. Watch what happens when you stop feeding others' need to approve of you and start trusting your own inner authority. If you're ready to stop abandoning yourself for others' approval, if you're ready to discover who you are when you're not constantly explaining yourself, write in the comments, I trust my own judgment. Let's create a community of people who have learned that authentic self-expression needs no justification. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring Jung's insights into individuation and the journey toward authentic self-possession. Because the world doesn't need more people who explain themselves into invisibility. The world needs people who trust themselves enough to exist boldly, without apology, without explanation, simply, authentically, powerfully themselves.